Hello everybody, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, 10 questions and answers. So, one of Dickens's first books, maybe Dickens's most famous books. I would probably say so. If you ask the average person in the street, name a book by Charles Dickens, I bet you that Oliver Twist would be 8 out of 10. Maybe Christmas Carol would be the next one in terms of the popularity and being well known. So, question one, when was the book published? The answer was 1837, and that was the year that Victoria came to the throne. Now, that is the very young Queen Victoria, of the dumpy old woman that we associate with the old Victoria, and that's what she looked like according to the artist at her coronation. The coronation was 1838, but she did ascend the throne in 1837, and in the same year, Oliver Twist came out. And in fact, she did actually read Oliver Twist. She was aware of what life was like in her kingdom, in her realm, and she did actually read Oliver Twist. Question two: why does the story begin in the workhouse? Because Oliver's mother, on a very, very stormy night, ends up in the workhouse, and she dies in the workhouse, giving birth to the little orphan boy Oliver. So the workhouse have to look after Oliver. And of course, he is continually told how grateful he should be to those who have given him the opportunity for life, which of course his mother did not have. Dickens hated the workhouse system. The workhouse system had been set up in 1834 under what was called the Poor Law Amendment Act to basically make life more difficult for the poor. It was felt that the poor were having too easy a time because they were getting poor relief without having to go into the workhouse. The workhouse was made as harsh as possible. The conditions and the way they were treated was so bad that you would rather take the lowest paid job than go into the workhouse. There was nothing worse than the workhouse. And apparently Thomas Malthus, whose ideas Dickens hated, he had contributed to the idea of setting up the workhouse system, though he actually died in the year that the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed through Parliament. And it was a classic example of Dickens using the novel to highlight the social conditions that he was so much against. Now, when Oliver is in the workhouse, he's under the control of Mr. Bumble, the Beadle. What was a Beadle? Well, a Beadle was a parish official who was responsible for looking after the poor, and in this case, Mr. Bumble of looking after Oliver Twist, making sure that the poor were disciplined and that they were grateful for all that was done to them. Mr. Bumble is not an attractive character, but he's not a kind of really wicked character because in a sense he's very much a comic character. And this is something that Dickens did with so many of his characters. If they were unpleasant but they were comical, it was very different to the ones who were just plainly unpleasant. Like, for example, Monks, who is the villain who tries to ruin Oliver's life, or Bill Sikes, who's incredibly violent. There's nothing comical about them. But Mr. Bumble, who is not a particularly likable character, but he is pompous, he's full of his own self-importance, and in a sense, he is a comical character. So that is Mr. Bumble, the Beadle. Question 4. How did Dickens know about the criminal underworld? So this is the world of Fagin and of Bill Sikes and the Artful Dodger and the others who make up the gang of pickpockets. Dickens, throughout his life, visited many of the worst slums in London that were known as rookeries. This book was written early in Dickens's career, but he was already aware of the terrible conditions in certain parts of London, and the thieves' den of Fagin is based on a place called Jacob's Island, which was like stuck out in the Thames in the Bermondsey area of southeast London. And this was just a place where criminal gangs operated. They were so poor that only through crime could they actually exist. And therefore, you've got the characters of Fagin, Artful Dodger, Bill Sikes, and Nancy, is based on characters that actually Dickens had either read about, or maybe he would even have visited with police protection. This place called Jacob's Island. If Oliver was an orphan, brought up in the workhouse, how come he spoke so posh? Now, this is something that many people have commented on, and it is a little bit unrealistic, well, to say the least. Oliver comes across as a well-educated little gentleman. He's completely in the wrong environment when he's with Fagin and the Artful Dodger, who laugh at him because of his naivety. But he seems to be in completely the right environment when he's with Mr. Brownlow and the other characters in the nice part of London. Well, of course, he is related ultimately to Mr. Brownlow and to Rose Maylie, who's actually his sister, and all that sort of stuff. That's part of the story. But the thing is, it's almost as if Dickens believed that if you had that kind of background, if you had that kind of middle or upper class background, that would come through as if it was part of your nature rather than the environment. If it was the environment that would bring about how Oliver spoke, he would have spoken a lot rougher than that. He would have spoken in the same way as the Artful Dodger and so forth. He should have been more at home in that world than he was in the world of Mr. Brownlow and the comfortable middle class. So that's a bit strange. And many people who read the book have thought, this doesn't seem to make sense. How come that this orphan who's never had a chance to go to school is like a kind of middle or upper class young gentleman? It does not make sense. Question 6. What can we say about the character Nancy? She helps Oliver, and of course because of that she ends up being murdered by Bill Sikes. She comes across as rough but warm-hearted. Now, in actual fact, a woman like Nancy, who worked with a criminal gang, would almost certainly have been a prostitute and would have brought money to the gang by selling herself on the streets. Now, Charles Dickens maybe hints at that in Oliver Twist, but he keeps away from the sort of, shall we say, the really seamy side of life. Most people who read Oliver Twist would have been the early Victorian middle class, and he didn't want to offend them. This was a feature of quite a bit of Victorian literature until we get to the later Victorian period, when they were a bit less willing to censor, and they were a bit more up top and honest about things like sex. But shall we say that Dickens never mentions these things in an explicit way? There's a hint there, but it's no more than a hint. But undoubtedly the real sort of Nancy would have been a prostitute. She would have brought the money from her trade to the rest of the criminals who are acting as pickpockets and burglars and so forth. But Charles Dickens couldn't bring himself to actually say that explicitly. Was the portrayal of lower class characters unusual at that time? Well, after saying that Dickens did not present the complete, the ultimately seamy side of life. He did show a variety of lifestyles, and he did have characters from different social classes. And in that sense, he was very different to an author like Jane Austen, who lived earlier in the 19th century, in the so-called Regency period, the period right at the beginning of the 19th century, when Britain was fighting the war against Napoleon. Now, she only presents members of the class that she knew, the gentry. They are the squires and the clergymen and the people not the richest, but in the very comfortable upper middle class sections. She doesn't really talk about lower class people at all. You get perhaps the inclusion of a servant at some point who has to serve members of the household, but that's the only thing that happens. There's no description of poor people. But Charles Dickens showed the whole of Victorian life. He had the upper classes, he had predominantly the middle classes. That was the class that he knew best of all. But he did have many lower class characters, and he showed them in a sympathetic light, by and large. Not so much in Oliver Twist, because he's dealing with the criminal underworld, he's dealing with Fagin, Artful Dodger, Bill Sikes. But in his other novels, he has the Peggottys, who are fishermen from Great Yarmouth. They're not well educated, but they're very decent people. And his classic example of a lower class character who is very lovable is Joe Gargery in Great Expectations, who is much better than any of the middle or upper class characters that he presents in that novel or other novels. So we can say that Charles Dickens, although he didn't show the very roughest side of life, his description of the slums and things like that are censored. They're not. The real conditions were much worse than the ones that Dickens portrayed. He had to present something that wasn't too disturbing, but at the same time he did show characters from many different aspects of life. Question 8. Why is The Murder of Nancy by Bill Sikes such a powerful piece of writing? Because Nancy takes pity on Oliver and meets Mr. Brownlow. Eventually, of course, the police become aware of Bill Sikes and the other members of the gang. So Bill Sikes is going to murder his girlfriend. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing when she screams and screams and screams and he beats her to death. This is an appalling murder. And Dickens shows the violence, he shows the terror of Nancy, who is unable to escape from the clutches of this monstrous character of Bill Sikes. And the thing is that Dickens, who was a good actor as well as a writer, he used to do public readings of his books, and they were absolutely exhausting. And when he did The Murder of Nancy by Bill Sikes, he put everything into it, and this may have contributed to his untimely death in 1870. In the summer of 1870, he was on tour and he was doing these readings, and that was one of the things that he did, and it took a lot out of him. His doctor had warned him that he was pushing himself too far. He took no notice of his doctor's orders, and as a result, he collapsed on stage, and shortly afterwards he died. But this is Charles Dickens at his very best. It's a horrible scene because, of course, you've got Nancy pleading for mercy, but Sikes shows no mercy at all and beats her to death. Now, Sikes is chased after by the police force. And the question here is, were the police a new thing in early Victorian London? Yes, they were. The Metropolitan Police had been set up in 1829 by Robert Peel. the Conservative or Tory Home Secretary, as it was called then. And it was designed to make the streets of London safer. Now, the Victorian streets of London you would have thought were quite violent. But in actual fact, I think the difference between Victorian society and pre-Victorian society is that in Victorian society, they managed to keep the crime and the violence confined to the poorer areas. Whereas in pre-Victorian society, because there was no police force at all, the criminal gangs would get into the richer areas and they would cause mayhem. But I think the Victorian period, the wealthier areas were quite peaceful and well ordered, but the huge amounts of crime and violence and disorder were in the poorer areas. And that was partly due to the success of the police. The police are presented in Oliver Twist. They were quite new then, but as the Victorian period moved on, they became a very familiar figure. And the idea of that kind of police force was transferred to all parts of the country. As you can see, they don't have a policeman's helmet. That came round about the 1860s, 1870s. They were dressed in a top hat, and they had a blue uniform, and they had a truncheon, and they had a rattle to begin with. So if a policeman was in trouble, he could use the rattle to get more policemen to help him. Later, that was changed to a whistle, of course. They were dressed as ordinary members of the public because Robert Peel didn't want to portray them as soldiers. England, and Britain as a whole, had this reputation of being a society where individual freedom was very important. The police were there to protect the law-abiding from the criminal. They were not there to oppress the people. In parts of Europe, the police were used in a political way to stamp down on political activity that the government was worried about. That, it was felt, would be a very un-British thing to do. And the other thing, of course, if you compare this with what happened in America, the police were not ordinarily given weapons. They were given a baton or a truncheon, but they were not given guns. They were not armed. And that became a difference between the police in Britain and the police in parts of the continent and the police in America as well. Final question, why have there been so many film adaptations of Oliver Twist? I think the answer is, it is a classic story. It's got everything in it. It's got criminals. It's got nice Mr. Brownlow. It's got Oliver Twist. Everybody feels sorry for him because he's an orphan. It's got comic characters like Mr. Bumble. And it's just a kind of easy story to follow. And it's perfect for films. And of course with musicals. This is Fagin, played by Alec Guinness. And this is from one of the great films that was made just after the end of the Second World War. It's a black and white film on a shoestring budget, because obviously after the war there wasn't a huge amount of money around in Britain, but they produced a classic. And this was the work of a very famous English film director called David Lean, who went on in the 1950s and 60s to produce many film masterpieces. But there were two Charles Dickens novels that were made into films in that period, just after World War II. One was Oliver Twist, and the other one was Great Expectations. And they're both classics of cinema. Even though they're black and white, they are very, very, very good films. So that is my little talk on Oliver Twist. Thank you very much.